This right here is the Clash Royale free-to-play evolutions tier list. We are going to be ranking every single evolution in Clash Royale, but exclusively for free-to-play players. With that being the case, this tier list is going to look a little different than your normal tier list. The evolutions that are going to be in the S and the A tier may not necessarily be the best right now, but they are going to be good and consistent evolutions that you won't regret investing your shards in. Another thing I would like to say is that every evolution in the game does have some sort of value. That is why there is no F tier on this tier list. I don't believe that any evolutions in the game are truly bad, and they all have some utility in some way. So with that being out of the way, let's begin. First up, we have the D tier, and there is one evolution that I'm going to put here, and it is the giant snowball. Now, the snowball did recently getting a buff, increasing its slow time, but I still just believe it's the worst evolution in the game. There are so many other evos that you can use in your deck that provide so much more value, and if you want an evolved 2 elixir spell, then the Evolve Zap is just so much better. So like I said, that's the only D tier card, and now we have the C tier, which still isn't the best, but these cards are definitely a lot better in certain situations. First up in C tier, we have the Evolved Musketeer. I think the Evolved Musketeer is one of the coolest evolutions in the game. Its sniper mechanic is super fun to use, and it can be really good for picking off supporting troops in the back, but really apart from that, it isn't the best evolution to use. Next up in C tier, we have the Battle Ram. You would think the Evo Battle Ram would be a lot better considering it can continuously ram and it spawns 2 Evolved Barbarians, but it really isn't that great. In a deck like P.E.K.K.A. Bridge Spam, yes, absolutely use the Battle Ram, but really apart from that, I wouldn't recommend it. Also, the Battle Ram itself isn't that good of a card, so really only use it if you are like dead set on using the Battle Ram. Next up, we have the Wall Breakers. The Wall Breakers are not a bad evolution by any stretch of the imagination, but really their whole gimmick is that they'll get to the tower much easier, but honestly, for the damage that they do, I don't think that gimmick is worth an evolution slot necessarily. I would really only recommend Wall Breakers if you want to play minor Wall Breakers cycle. And last up in the C tier, we have the Evolved Barbarians. I know everyone just got this evolution for free and probably wants to use it, but really I would only recommend using it if you are playing Lava Hound. They're pretty easy to counter with anything that does splash damage or the Fireball especially, and apart from Lava Hound, there are just better options for evolutions that you can use. Next up, we have the B tier, and this is where cards really start to get viable with their evolutions, and all of these can be really good in multiple situations. First up in B tier, we have the Mortar. If you play Mortar, then you should absolutely have this evolution. I think that's kind of obvious though. The little goblin that it shoots out can be so annoying, and it can result in a lot of damage on your opponent's tower, and your opponent is pretty much gonna have to commit extra to it, which will give you a positive elixir exchange. Next up, we have the Evolved Archers. I absolutely adore the Evolved Archers. I think they are awesome. Their extra damage they can do from a distance makes them really cool to play, especially at the bridge. I think they're really cool in that situation. However, there is one other 3 elixir ranged evolution that I think is just better. But you absolutely cannot go wrong with evolving the archers. Next up in B tier, we have the Evolved Skeletons. Now, I would have put them in A tier, but they recently nerfed the skeletons from 4 to 3. However, still for a 1 elixir evolution, the amount of damage they can output is absolutely crazy. And even if your opponent counters them pretty easily, then it's still only a 1 elixir commitment, and it's not really the end of the world. Next up is the other 1 elixir evolution, and that is the Ice Spirit. The Evo Ice Spirit is actually used quite a lot competitively. However, I don't feel like it necessarily provides that same value for the general player base. However, I still think it's a good evolution. That freeze can be really beneficial for crowd control, for resetting, and for stunning troops. Next up, we have the Evolved Goblin Giant. I was really close to putting this one in A tier, but I decided to put it in B tier. Those goblins that it spawns when it reaches half health are super valuable. They can help clear the way for the Goblin Giant and also for the Sparky behind the Goblin Giant, because Goblin Giant is pretty much always played with Sparky. Next up, we have the Diddy Cage. Goblin Cage is my personal favorite building in Clash Royale, and I think the evolution is pretty good for it as well. That pulling ability can work really well against Hog Riders, Ram Riders, Battle Rams, and things like that, and it can also work well against tanks and help break up beatdown pushes. Next up is B for Bomber. Its extra bounce that it does can be a little bit hard to line up sometimes. However, if you are able to do that, the value that it can provide is absolutely insane. Next up, we have the Tesla. It honestly might be a hot take having Tesla this high. However, I am of the belief that I think Tesla is one of the safest buildings for you to invest into, because even though over the past few months it has been nerfed quite a bit, I still think Tesla is super reliable. It's a cheap, 4 elixir building that works really well in a lot of different decks, and the evolution goes really well with that, and it can do a stun and reset cards like Inferno Dragon and Sparky. I think it's a solid evolution overall. Next up is the Dart Goblin. Dart Goblin is definitely a fan favorite card in this game, and the evolution just makes the Dart Goblin better. Against Swarm or big pushes, if you can protect the Evo Dart Goblin, then that poison damage can stack up and it can absolutely wreck anything your opponent has. And last up in the B tier, we have the Goblin Barrel. Now, I would have put the Goblin Barrel in A tier, but it recently got nerfed, so that way the Decoy Barrel is easily distinguishable. With that being the case, it lost a good bit of its viability, but if your opponent isn't paying attention, then you still can fool them. All right, next up we are in A tier. These evolutions are really good. You should definitely consider getting evolutions for these cards. First up in A tier, we have the Evolved Cannon. I think Cannon is probably the best building in the game. It's 3 elixir, it's a common card, it's super easy to use, super easy to level up, and the evolution just makes it that much better. That barrage that it does can be super good on defense. Next up in the A tier, we have the Royal Giant. The Royal Giant evolution is honestly nothing special right now. However, this is a case where I feel like the Royal Giant has been a consistently decent evolution for a long period of time, and I think it will continue that trajectory. Its ability can counter any swarm, and it can be really hard to defend against if you don't have the right counters. Next up in A tier, we have the Evolved Wizard. Again, this is a similar case to the Evolved Royal Giant. The Evolved Wizard is nothing too special right now in Clash Royale. However, this is a good consistent evolution that you can rely on. That shield that it has where it can be protected from any spell initially is a great ability to have, especially with how many people play Fireball and Poison these days. Next up in A tier is the Evolved Lumberjack. Now, the Evolved Lumberjack has gotten nerfed like 3 different times since its release. But despite that, this is still a dang good evolution. That ghost that it has, I think will always make it somewhat good, because that just provides so much value as long as it's within the rage spell, and it just makes the Evo Lumberjack that much better. Even if it gets nerfed again, I still recommend Evo Lumberjack. Next up, we have the Evolved Royal Recruits. The Evo Recruits are my personal favorite evolution in the entire game. They are so fun to play, and they are so low skill. They can be dealt with, however, with a lot of splash damage, but they're so good on defense, and they're so good for counter pushing with that charge, it's hard for me to not recommend them. Next up, we have the Electro Dragon. This one is borderline S tier for me, but I decided to put it in A tier because I definitely think it is susceptible to get nerfed again in the future. Its Chain Lightning is absolutely absurd. Quite literally one of the best abilities that any card has in the game. However, like I said, I have a hunch that this will get nerfed again at some point. And when that is the case, it'll probably drop below A tier. So Evo Electro Dragon is still good enough to the point where I can recommend it, but also evolve it at your own risk. Next up, we have the Bats. Bats are just so good, so consistent, so reliable. The normal Bats are just a good cheap cycle card that can deal with air cards, and then the evolution just takes that and makes them better. What can you say? The Bats are great. Next up, we have probably my hottest take of the video, and that is the Evolved Goblin Drill. I do not see a lot of people use the Evolved Goblin Drill, even competitively, but I absolutely love this card. At least from my personal experience playing it, a lot of people sometimes just don't know what to do with it because it goes under and comes up so many times and spawns so many goblins. It can provide a lot of value and it can easily overwhelm your opponent. However, a lot of Goblin Drill decks do tend to be on the higher end of the skill cap. So again, evolve at your own risk if you think you're good enough to use Goblin Drill. And our last evolution in the A tier is going to be the Valkyrie. Just another great and solid evolution. That tornado ability is really good for crowd control, and also against things like Hog Riders, they can prevent a lot of hog damage on the tower. The Evolved Valkyrie is just very nice. And then last up, we have the S tier. I believe for free-to-play players, these are the best of the best evolutions in the entire game. For the most part, I would consider them nerf-proof, meaning that regardless of whatever balance they get, I still think they are going to be good, solid evolutions, and you need to get these evolved, like ASAP. First up, we have the Evolved Knight. The Evolved Knight has quite literally been nerfed 5 separate times, and it is still one of the best evolutions in the entire game. That damage reduction that it has while moving is just so good, and it makes it so that way you have to deal with the Evolved Knight with something. You cannot ignore it. And really, for any archetype that uses Knight, which is a lot of them, Adding Evolve Knight in that deck just makes it so much better. Next up, we have the Evolved P.E.K.K.A. The Evolved P.E.K.K.A. has also been nerfed a lot, but the ability to heal after defeating an enemy is just so broken still, I think. P.E.K.K.A. is already a really good card to invest in, and then taking that P.E.K.K.A. and giving it the ability to recover health, yeah, that's an S tier evolution. Next up is everyone's favorite, the Evolved Mega Knight. Whether you love him or you hate him, you got to admit that he's good. Mega Knight is one of the best defensive cards in the entire game, one of the easiest cards to use in the entire game, and then the Evolved Mega Knight just takes that and escalates it times 10. Yeah, he is that good. He isn't the best evolution competitively. I would say on that scale, he might be B or C tier, but for the general average everyday Clash Royale player, Evo Mega Knight is an absolute must. Next up, we have the Evolved Zap. Remember earlier when I mentioned the Evolved Snowball and I mentioned that there was a 2 elixir evolution that was much better? Yeah, that's the Evolved Zap. I mean, again, it all just boils down to this is a card you cannot go wrong with. It has the exact same properties of a Zap, and then it multiplies that times 2 and does more damage as well. Yeah, this is a good evolution. You absolutely need it. And then last, but certainly not least, the Evolved Firecracker. Again, remember earlier when I talked about the Evolved Archers and I mentioned how there is a 3 elixir ranged evolution that is better. Yes, that is the Evolved Firecracker, ladies and gentlemen. The Evolved Firecracker is one of the most annoying evolutions in Clash Royale history. And if your opponent cannot deal with it effectively, then you are going to have an absolute field day with it. Her splash damage can give you so much value, and really for any ranged evolution, I think this is your best bet. Oh yeah, and one evolution I totally forgot about is the newest evolution, the Evolved Hunter. Now, as I'm recording this, I have only gotten to play with the Evolved Hunter in the developer build, so I haven't gotten to play it against actual real players, but based on that experience, I'm going to put it in B tier. I think the net that it has is a super unique mechanic, and it synergizes well with a bunch of other cards, but I still feel like the net in some cases can be a little bit niche, but in those niche cases, it's really good. So here we go. Here is the full free-to-play evolution tier list. Once again, this may not look like your normal evolution tier list because I was ranking these based off of different criteria. But if you are a free-to-play player out there, I hope this tier list will help you make good decisions on what cards to evolve. That's gonna be it for me. If you enjoyed, be sure to leave a like, and if you're new here, be sure to subscribe, and I'll see you all in the next video.